Home Abstract and Title Company was founded in 1867 and is the oldest company still operating in McLennan County. Home Abstract is comprised of a team of honest, friendly, hardworking professionals dedicated to providing both commercial and residential real estate clients with the highest level of communication and service. Their team is committed to working hard and building and maintaining strong relationships because transactions are so much more than just deals. They are clients, deserving of the courtesy, care, and respect that Home Abstract and Title Company is known for. Visit Home Abstract and Title Company at homeabstract.com.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. This continues our Crossroads series that Rick Tullis and I have been doing on Waco history, looking at Waco as Crossroads. Although through Rick's research, we're trying to get Hub City traction as a tag.
I found that as something they actually called it themselves, right? We've talked about it before. 1870s, you got the roads, you got the river, you've got the trains coming into town. They called themselves Hub City.
Hashtag Hub City.
Hopefully that trademark's expired if we want to use it. So
this particular episode is looking at Waco as a political crossroads, and there's only one local figure that we could bring in to talk about politics, and it is the mayor, Dillon Meek. So the Honorable Dillon Meek is with us today. Thank you, Dillon, for being with us.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. Thanks for letting me join you guys today.
yeah. Hey, so Dillon, we got you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? How'd you get to Waco? And what led you to become mayor?
Really glad to be here today. I've always told Rick he had a face for radio, so it's,
some might disagree.
It's perfect.
It's not even that good.
We're able to join one another. I grew up in a small town outside of Victoria, Texas. My dad's a cattle rancher. Mom was a public school teacher. Came to Baylor in the fall of 2003. Graduated in 2007 from undergrad and 2010 from law school, and stuck around Waco. Met my wife at Baylor, Lindsay. We have 2 kiddos. Mabry just turned 6, and our son Davis is 4. And
they're Wacoans by birth, right?
Wacoans by birth, yeah, that's right.
Mm.
And got a job here after law school and fell in love with the city and have been here ever since.
Yeah. And a little trivia, that's actually how I met Dillon the first time. He needed an expert witness on a legal thing he was working on.
Yeah, it was a court case involving an HVAC unit, and Rick was going to be our expert star witness. We ended up settling the case before trial.
Yeah, well, I brought such a strong presence to the case. They were able to settle.
They caved.
Yeah,
they caved.
Intimidating. Yeah.
Great. Well, I say we dive in. I mean, politics, of course, is important anywhere. But I think as we've dug through the history, there's some things, interestingly, that happen in Waco that don't happen everywhere. And hopefully we'll unplug that. There's different layers. There's the local political scene, which we've got Dillon here to unpack for us a little bit. Then there's also the state and federal government stuff that has happened over the years as well. So let's start at the very beginning.
All right. Yeah, let's start with Waco and talk a little bit more about Waco, and then we can talk about Waco's engagement, statewide, national, that sort of thing.
Right. And I would back up a little bit. The county government was way more important than the city government. Sorry, Dillon. In early Texas, right? It was a more of an agrarian society. Not many people lived in cities. Cities were the place you went to go get more supplies, or because of travel, or if it's a hub city, that's you're going through there as you're driving your cattle up. But
so it was a bit of a coup for Waco to secure the county seat. In 1850, when it was secured. And
I came across this interesting quote from George E. Rath. So pulled it out of that 1876 handbook we've talked about before. But he's talking about the county being founded in 1850. So here he goes. At the first election day, but 60 votes were counted. And at this election, it was made manifest that in that day, more Democrats moved to the new countries than Whigs, there being only about 4 Whig votes cast in that election. When the county was organized, the settlements were in particular localities, of which there were but 3, known as Erath Settlement, White Rock Settlement, and the Waco Settlement. So the first election only had 70 votes or 60 votes. Sounds like your first city council election.
It was a little more than that, but not by much.
Right.
Yeah, one thing I thought too was interesting was how much Erath, because I think so much of politics is about people. And I thought it was really interesting how much he wanted Waco to be developed as a city. And he actually reached out, based on my research, to Jacob de Cordova, who is one of the landowners, and was strategic in saying, we need to build the city here. Asked him to draw up the city. Erath went and then surveyed it. And there was a bit of a battle between Rebecca de Cordova and Erath on what the name of Waco would be.
Yeah.
They wanted to, Rebecca de Cordova wanted to name it Lamartine.
Lamartine. We think. I don't know. The pronunciation may be lost to history here, but yeah.
And then, he was able to compel enough people to rally around the idea of Waco. And so that was another kind of early political maneuvering of 2 powerful people trying to make a decision that they think is best to land on what would or wouldn't be the best outcome. But we know what won in that circumstance.
Right. We're not sitting here doing the Lamartine history podcast, so that's...
Or the Flying L logo. I don't know if that would have been...
Not nearly successful.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about that. Just they offering land for a courthouse, offering parcels of land in that deal to make sure it was the county seat.
Well, but it actually had to get voted on. So I've got Erath wrote further. The act of the legislature to create the county, they appointed 6 or 7 men to locate the county seat. So it wasn't in the bag for Waco. They had to locate it. The names of whom, as I recollect, were S.P. Ross, Neil McLennan, Lear Davis, Claiborne Varner, David Landon, Nathan Puckett, and perhaps another. They were in favor of Waco except one, and the people generally favored the place. End quote. I think it's funny. Have you ever been part of starting something and you're trying to remember, oh yeah, I think so-and-so was there, and I think we did this, and all right, we chose Waco. No big deal. So that's basically what happened.
And a good way to get something named after you is not be there at the meeting when it's organized,
right? Or get put in charge of it.
So Rick, you've done research. Is Waco important, kind of politically, even early on?
Yeah. So as we've talked about the location of Waco in the state, I can imagine. I don't know exactly the reason for doing it, but there was one of the first recorded state Democrat conventions in Waco in 1857. So they showed up here. I'm sure it was a great middle ground for a lot of them to meet. But they had about 300 delegates from 90 different counties at the time, and that resulted in the nomination of a guy named Hardin Runnels, who became the 5th governor of Texas.
Mm-hmm. And as we've talked about before, Waco is going to kind of be known for governors. We'll talk about those as we go ahead, but several different governors are going to come from Waco.
Yeah. But let's talk a little bit more about Waco as it develops.
Yeah, sounds good.
While we got the mayor here. It's interesting to think about in 1850, there were only about 800 people that lived in what was Waco, but 6,200 people lived in the county as a whole. So, a vast majority of people actually lived out in the country. I mean, it was a farming was the main industry at the time. So it makes sense, right? And they didn't have big agricultural farming or mechanical farming like we have now. I mean, somebody farmed 100 or 200 acres at most. So, the city government, Dillon, you got any insight on how that evolved? I mean, I know Texas has different rules about what kind of acceptable city government you can have, and I'm sure that's evolved over time as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because and a bit technical, but the city was incorporated by an act of legislation in 1857. And it was in 1862 that the first charter was actually surrendered, and then the city just existed under this General Incorporation Act until another charter was actually granted in 1871. And then the first mayor of Waco was a guy named Captain J.M. Smith, and they elected the city attorney back there. Now we appoint the city attorney, and it was someone named C.B. Pierre, who was the first city attorney. Again, I might not be pronouncing that right, but I think I am. But it was in 1908 when the population of the city really began to grow that the city shifted and adopted a commissioner form of government. And this overwhelmingly passed. It was an interesting, this is what my research showed, and I don't know exactly how this played out, but 15 people were selecting 4 citizens to be appointed as commissioners. And this system was voted on by the whole population. But then 15 people were selected to appoint 4 commissioners, and each of the commissioners were successful in business and had accepted a public office at the sacrifice of their own private interest at the earnest solicitation of the committee and yielded to the public demand for their services as part of their patriotic duty, was what this handbook that was published in 1908 said. So it was really interesting to me to see that they wanted to shift to this commissioner style of government, and that existed until 1946 in that manner. And so it was really interesting to me to see how that went about. But
well, and I think that commissioner style was also used in the counties. I think that was what people were used to seeing.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's why they just adopted it for the city as well. I mean, we see it today. We have one county judge and 4 commissioners that divide the county in 4 equal parts.
A big shift in that nationally with municipal politics is Galveston. So after the 1900 flood, when Galveston is wiped out, they come in and reconstitute the government, and they establish a commission form of government. It's one of the first municipal kind of governments, and it's during an era where they're wanting qualified people to hold these sorts of positions instead of parties that win appointing their cronies to controlling the police or controlling sanitation. They want people that have training and expertise in those sorts of areas.
It was really interesting to me that in researching whether or not to adopt this form of government, they toured many cities that had adopted it across the state to try to understand best practices, pros and cons, and then come back and sell it to the electorate as to why this would be better. And it was really interesting around that time period, in a 1912 handbook, they really discussed some of the achievements that had come to be between 1908 when they passed this form of government and 1912 when this handbook was issued. Now, it was issued by the city, so obviously you're kind of putting your best foot forward, but it was interesting.
Are you saying the city sometimes only tells us what we want to hear?
Not now.
You heard it here.
This
folks.
was in 1912.
Yeah. Okay, that would never happen today.
But it was interesting. This handbook, it covered everything that was going on in municipal government: streets, water, parks, growing the economy. There's this real commitment to building beautiful buildings. There's a real commitment to strategy. So it was interesting to me. There were some in this 1912 municipal government handbook, Waco municipal government handbook. There were some interesting things that I noted. So there's all the saloons were removed from residential districts between 1908 and 1912. It was kind of like the 1912 short-term rental debate of how we're going to.
It's the SDRs of
the zoning controversies. Tuberculosis was the greatest cause of death in 1912. So different public health issues that they were facing then. But there's an interesting chapter on how to address public health. And coming out of COVID, it really is this interesting dynamic of how communities have tried to be forward-thinking and strategic about addressing public health at the time.
Well, and it wasn't too much after that 1912. 1918 is when the Spanish flu came through, and that probably hit Camp MacArthur pretty hard, I would expect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a band named Alessandro's Band that played in the parks semi-weekly in the summer, so kind of like the Brazos Nights of 1912.
So So nothing. The city's doing nothing
No,
original now.
we're just caught. We think we are. That's the scary thing is we think we are. It's just all been done. Fire trucks consisted of horses and wagons. So luckily that we're not putting out fires by that form anymore. But it was interesting to me. They actually were having a debate on whether or not to continue to have a volunteer fire department or not. And I thought that was interesting because they were trying to weigh fiscal constraints against the professionalism that would come from a municipal taxpayer-paid fire force. This is another great quote that I really think was interesting and also rings true for what it feels like in Waco right now. And this is from the mayor, and it said, "If Waco continues to grow as fast as she has in the last 3 years, it will take all of our resources, both by bonds and taxation, to extend and build streets, furnish lights, sewers, water, additional police and fire protection absolutely necessary to the continued and healthy growth of the city." I thought that was really interesting that, again, they're trying to be strategic. They're trying to grow this city. They're in this time of great growth. Mm-hmm. And it feels that could be something that we say in a city meeting.
I think you said that I heard you say that at a speech not too long ago.
Exactly right now, because it is really a moment of great opportunity, great growth, but also you have to be strategic about your financial resources as you grow. But I did really like that it said, the mayor in that handbook, that 1912 handbook, vowed that every citizen of Waco may have any business with the city, be he humble or great, regardless of race or color or politics, receive the same degree of honored consideration. And so I think that there was also this culture of wanting to bring dignity and honor and respect to the people of the community. And I hope that that's been a legacy that has carried on. And obviously, if you look back on our history, there's many marks of getting that wrong and that not becoming realized at all. So I think history are like people. There's things that you got to repent of, and there are things that you celebrate. But that quote or that desire, if heartfelt at the time, is something of honor for sure. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting to me to see so many similarities in this 1912 form of government that was existing in trying to take that commissioner form of government and really modernize the city with water and infrastructure.
Right. So do you know at what point it switched to the council form of government?
Yeah. So in 1946, there was an election held, and at that time, there were 6 commissioners from 6 different precincts that would become elected. So there's a bit of a charter revision. The mayor, city secretary, city attorney, city tax assessor and collector, and city recorder were all elected at large. So of any of those now, there is no city tax assessor and collector. Later down the road, that was became a county position. And currently, the city secretary
and it got it pulled that. Each government entity used to do their own tax collections, like every school district, every municipality, the county, and that all got consolidated.
Eventually was centralized.
I think in the 80s, 1980s, into what we now know as the place we all go protest our property taxes.
Exactly. Yeah.
But there was this charter amendment in the 40s, but it was still under a commissioner form of government. It just increased the number of commissioners and increased some of the positions that were elected. And then there's another charter amendment from 1948 to 1988. It was a very small charter amendment. It wasn't a significant one. But one of the things was the mayor was selected by the city council members. And so what was really interesting to me was in the 50s, in response to an African-American wanting to run for office, the city did another charter amendment. They, at this point, they are no longer called commissioners, but they're called council. They're called councilmen in the 50s. Now we call it council members. But this charter was put into effect and adopted in 1958. And what happened is it was all at large seats throughout the entirety of the city. So whoever is running for a seat has to be elected at large. Now, in 1966, Dr. G.H. Radford was elected as the first African American to city council under this at-large model. So there were still people who were able to, people of color who, a man of color was able to get elected. It was a really compelling story on him. He was a dentist and a historian and authored a book called The African American Heritage in Waco, Texas. And it's really, there's a lot attributed to him for really preserving the history of African American culture. But he was the first African American elected to city council in this at-large system. So one of the, I think, greatest badges of honor that Waco carries is that it was the first city in the state of Texas to elect an African American mayor, and that was Oscar Ducange. And he rose to local prominence through his civil service, and he was really dedicated to improving the lives of Waco. And in 1972, he ran for and won a city council seat, and he really earned the affection of his part of the city, but then ran unopposed in 1974 to retain his seat, but then was selected as mayor by his co-city council members. And that was, again, the first. There's actually a Dallas Morning News ran an article, and the headline of it said, Black and Catholic, Ducange was selected this week by his fellow white councilmen to serve as mayor in this predominantly Baptist city, which in the past has been white ruled. And so it made statewide news that Waco was the first to have a black mayor. And I think that is something that Waco probably often forgets, but also should really celebrate. But that came to be after a decades-old effort to reform the voting practices in Waco, because as I mentioned, when the city saw its first black candidate for city council in the 50s, Waco transitioned from the single-member districts to at-large seats. The effect of that was that the entire city voted, which really protected a majority white leadership structure. But in 1972, the League of Women Voters started a committee that challenged that system and later brought a lawsuit against it. And the Austin lawyer David Richards, who was the was the husband of the future governor, Ann Richards, took that case. And the petitioners were William Halliburton, Leila Briscoe, Roland Areola, Pete Arvizus, Francis Ortega, Kathy Patterson, Myrtle McKinney, Jane Derrick, and Wilbert Austin, who I had the honor of serving on Waco City Council with, who became a city council member himself after having first served honorably as a plaintiff in this lawsuit. And on April 19th, 1976, an Austin judge ruled in favor of the Wacoans and ordered that the city change to a single-member district system of electing the council. So while the fight for social justice and systemic equity remained elusive for many Wacoans of color, this ruling ushered in a period in which elected officials began to more accurately represent their constituencies. Still have a long way to go on this, but definitely was a major milestone in elected officials representing their constituencies. So a really cool piece of history. In 1977, one of those plaintiffs, Roland Areola, was the first Mexican-American elected to the city council, and he eventually served as mayor in 1982. So our first Hispanic mayor was in 1982. Marilyn Jones was the first woman and the first black woman to serve on the Waco City Council in 1980. Another first is Linnell McNamara became the first female mayor of Waco, but she again was elected or appointed by her peers on the city council at that time. In 1988, we had another charter change, and the mayor became an elected office by the general public for the first time since 1948. And that was Mayor Patillo was the first mayor to be elected in office by the general public. Alice Rodriguez continues to serve on our city council, but she was the first city council member, first Hispanic female elected to serve on city council in 1991. And then another interesting statistic was it was in 2004, Mae Jackson was the first black woman to be elected as mayor. Her daughter, Andrea Bearfield, a dear friend and esteemed colleague of mine, serves on the Waco City Council currently. But in that year, in 2004, it was the first time in the history of the council that it was predominantly female. Virginia Dupuy, Robin McDurham, LaRue Dorsey, and of course Mayor Jackson were all serving on the city council at that time. So,
well, and Andre's not the first offspring of a previous council member to serve, if I'm correct, if I'm thinking about that right. There's been a long line of Duncans that have served.
Yep.
And there's probably some others. I don't know if any others come to mind.
But no, that's
families
that,
that
absolutely,
have given and served in that way.
Malcolm Duncan Sr. definitely served, and Malcolm Duncan Jr. were both mayors of the city of Waco. So lineage of public service to the community.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, again, those are some of the statistics that I thought were interesting in terms of how Waco's city council's evolved, some of the history, how, like so many parts of American history, race impacted outcomes. And part of that is, again, this tragedy that we need to repent of. And I think in the 50s, when there was this desire to protect power in the white class, and then celebrate the milestones that have come since then to really see a more equitable, diverse group of leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested, the process of creating districts, when they kind of went back in the 80s and they had to create districts. Do you know the process by which they did that?
You just did it recently, actually.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting because there's great latitude in the rules that require, one man, one vote. There cannot be racial discrimination in this process, but there's also a lot of latitude in how you do that. We just did this recently in Waco, and it was a very collaborative process. But it is interesting to see, again, in local government, which I think local government really is a place where, unlike what you see right now, particularly in these days in state and federal politics, where relationship triumphs oftentimes over partisanship or politics, Waco has been and remains a nonpartisan form of government. So when we run for office, we don't affiliate with a political party, and that carries through oftentimes in how districts get formed, at least in the modern day of Waco, in the sense that the goal is not per se for a political party to triumph, but rather how do we try to get districts set up in a way that is going to be fair and representative of the community that we serve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, do we want to? Is there anything else on the city that you want to share with us before we start opening it up to some of the other parts of the political story of Waco? That's all I brought. Is there anything what do you guys think? Am I missing anything? Any things that y'all recall that you want to camp out on? Any other characters along the way that you ran into as you were doing your research? No. Okay.
So I'd like to ask you, Mayor Meek. So if we're talking about Waco as kind of a crossroads, just this, position Waco has. I mean, if we think of it politically, even in your time and as a council person and as mayor, talk about kind of how Waco's positioned in Texas as far as with that kind of crossroads from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that it really has always been a geographical crossroads. Center of Texas, that's why we have the slogan, the heart of Texas. We're in the middle of the state, and there's an advantage that comes from the middle of the state. I think there's also, there is a legacy of strategy and proactivity in capitalizing on that opportunity. It's not by accident that there's a suspension bridge in the middle of town. There was a group of city leaders who came together and raised money to procure this bridge so that this city could be a crossroads, to be that place where people came. And so what we see is this really rich history of that Crossroads experience with a robust history of Tejano and Hispanic populations that grew up in the city. You have the industrial north that came to Waco as it began to expand in the early 20th century. There's a history of Deep South. There's this great history of Black gospel music in the city of Waco. So there's this real crossroads of culture that is representative and continues to be representative of this history of a melting pot city, largely because of its geographic location, combined with some natural resources and combined with some strategy like the construction of the suspension bridge and some other things that the city endeavored to do.
Yeah. Now, we haven't talked about it yet, but when we start talking about state politics and federal level politics, there seems to be a loose correlation between, I think, the health and wealth of the city and its position in the state and its political clout in the state. When cotton was the main thing, I mean, I think Waco was a growing, vibrant, healthy city in the middle of the state. So not only just being a crossroads, but was a major player for that reason, because it had a lot more. When you look historically, political clout, things where, as we'll talk about when we start talking about governors, stuff like that, people coming out of Waco were taking much bigger leadership roles than we see today. But I look at that and go, when we're talking about the future, I feel like Waco's again on a rising trajectory, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in our community's political clout going forward.
But part of that also is the population of the city. Waco used to be one of the largest cities in the state of Texas, and due to historical factors, that shifted. Some of the big factors that I look at is the tornado. The more I understand the history of this city, that tornado ripping through downtown had a bigger impact on the population, the economy, and therefore the population of the city than I used to give it credit for. I grew up on the coast. Hurricanes would come through a city. Not many, and there's exceptions to this. I think people left the city of New Orleans in an epic storm like Katrina, but where I grew up on the coast, when a hurricane comes through, your insurance pays for it, and in modern times, you just rebuild. And that was not available after a devastating storm like that. So I think there's a real setback on the economy and a real setback on the population growth of the city after that storm. Right. And then you look at Connally Air Force Base relocating, and the thousands of middle-class employees and economic engine of thousands of people with disposable income leaving. And then you look at General Tire in the 80s and the thousands of middle-class earners not having that income source anymore or leaving, resulting in so there's this kind of ebb and flow in the economy that I think directly impacted the population growth, which in some ways impacts the ability to have someone have that level of clout to run for statewide or national offices.
Sure.
If you were one of the major cities, I think there is an impact to that, and and Waco's history plays a role in that.
Yeah, and the collapse of the cotton industry.
Yep, that's another. Yep, absolutely.
As that moved out of our area and took that economic engine with it. So great. Well, hey, let's. You want to shift a little bit? Let's start talking some state politics.
Do we want to take it? I want to end with one quote that I think was good. So let's end with this quote. This was from that Waco handbook, and this was Mayor Mackey from the 1912 Waco handbook, and it said, "Allow me to make an earnest appeal to every citizen of Waco who's interested in the progress, the upbuilding, the uplifting, and the advancement of our beautiful and beloved Waco to join hands with the city administration to that end, that we may accomplish great and good things for Waco." End quote. And I think that is such a beautifully worded quote on the ambition that the city government and city leaders had in 1912. And you look at what they were able to accomplish, and you can look at some of the beautiful buildings that were built in this era that kind of followed this time of strategy. And you look at the prosperity that flowed. And again, it wasn't a perfect time. There's a lot of bad things that happened in the years to follow that quote being made. But there was also many good things that happened too. And so again, repent of the bad, but celebrate the good. And my hope is that as we move forward, we can move forward as a city with that kind of same ambition, that same kind of optimism for good and bright days ahead.
Very good. Well, the mayor's got to continue to work for you, the listener, but I want to ask him a question before he leaves because, Rick, the mayor is a young man, particularly compared to you and me.
Oh, yeah.
He's a young man.
Yep.
But I'm interested, one thing I know about you, Dillon, is you've always had an interest in local history. I mean, that, there's plenty for mayor to deal with in the present, and there's plenty to worry about with the future. Why has history been something that you've been interested in locally?
I think it's really interesting. I think it's like a big story, and history always can read like a novel. Sometimes it's exciting, it's dynamic, it's so much of humanity is exposed in history. I think that Waco particularly, that's the case. Waco has particularly big successes and particularly big dark. There's bright light that comes from Waco's history and darkness that comes from Waco's history. And I think that we have to respond to both of those things appropriately. But I think that another reason is because I think history absolutely informs where we're going in the future. And so when we're trying to understand our economy or how to build financial security in the community or try to know why things are the way that they are right now, you have to understand history. So to understand where you're headed, you got to know where you came from. And so it's really critical and vital, I think, to really understand at least some of the big building blocks of our history. And it's also, again, dynamic and exciting and interesting and fascinating to see how good, smart people were trying to do good for their community and in some ways did excellent with that heart, and in some ways failed greatly. But
do you think we need more history professors?
No.
Do you think they should be paid more?
The ones we have definitely need to be paid more.
I think the interesting ones should be paid more.
Well, we're going to thank the mayor for being. We're going to take a break now, but we're going to thank the mayor for being with us today.
Thank y'all for having me. It's been an honor.
Ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco. I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
All right, welcome back from that first ever commercial break on the Waco History Podcast as the mayor had to leave and go off and do something mayoral. And so we're continuing our conversation about political crossroads of Waco. And so, Rick, where do you think we ought to go next?
Let's hit the state. Let's hit state politics. There's a rich history there when it comes to Waco, especially in the first part of Waco's history. So I mentioned before already that it had been in 1857 had been the hub or had been the site for the first state Democrat convention. And then not too long after that, we started having a series of governors that hailed from Waco. Started with a gentleman named Richard Koch.
Yeah, Richard Koch, whose grave is fairly prominent in Oakwood Cemetery. I've seen his grave over there. Is governor from 1874 to 1876, and he's kind of interesting because he is the first post-Reconstruction governor. Reconstruction isn't fully in until 1877, but he is a former. He served in the Confederate Army,
right?
And it's under Koch that we begin to see the Klan activity kind of rise in Texas, and so steps taken post. Not that Koch's leading it, but going to kind of set the tone for what happens in the late 19th century.
Yeah, and that's more color to what you're saying. I think part of Reconstruction was if you served in the Confederate Army, you were not allowed to have a public office through the period of Reconstruction. So, so you could see. I think of it even in terms of today's political activity, how the pendulums swing so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this period of time coming out of Reconstruction would have been a heavy pendulum swing, I think. And that's where you end up with Richard Koch and kind of the environment that comes out of that. Him even after he was, so it was the first election where these Texans that had served were able to run for office. He overwhelmingly won, but the sitting governor, who was the last Reconstruction governor,
Edmund Davis. Yeah.
He was not willing to give up the seat.
Mm-hmm.
There was some controversy there. There was some controversy about election rigging.
It goes up to the Texas Supreme Court for a final decision to be declared. But and so that Davis, as he eventually exits, it's going to be a long time before another Republican is elected in Texas.
Right, and if I remember right, he appealed to the president at the time, which would have been Grant, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Appealed to Grant to send in troops to Texas, and Grant wouldn't do it, and that ended his. He knew he couldn't hold on after that point, and turned it over.
I do have a description of Koch if you want to get a visual.
Yeah,
for him.
would love to.
A white-bearded, hulking figure who towered 6 feet 3 inches and weighed 240 pounds. He said that on a political platform he could bellow like a prairie bull. And
hold on, I think I may be sitting across from the reincarnation of Richard Koch.
I'm not 240. Come on. So, but a really important late 19th century figure was Richard Koch.
Interestingly enough, and we might mention this again when we talk federal. He goes on to become a senator,
Mm-hmm.
or one of the senators for Texas. In fact, he left his last term of governor. He resigned to become senator, because at the time I think senators were elected by the state legislatures.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's going to be an issue in the late 19th century. Is direct election of senators is a populist platform in the late 19th century.
Now, something a lot of our local friends, not necessarily you or I, because we went somewhere else to college, but it was under his watch that Texas A&M was started.
Mm-hmm.
And he made several other educational improvements or progressive educational changes to public schooling at many levels, but starting Texas A&M was one of them.
So a good segue there, because A&M's also connected to our next governor.
Yes,
we're going to talk about, who continues to make headlines at A&M every now and then. Sol Ross. Yeah.
Yes. And talk about somebody who needs his own podcast, maybe his own movie. I mean, the life of Sol Ross is incredibly interesting, and we won't unpack all of it here. But after Reconstruction, I think one of the requirements were each of the states that had joined the Confederacy had to rewrite their constitutions. They weren't allowed to keep the same constitution. Ironically, prior to the Civil War, Texas was known to have one of the best constitutions of many of the states, because they'd just written it in 1845. Had the benefit of, a lot of the others had gone before them, so they'd written a solid constitution. They come out of Reconstruction, have had to rewrite their constitution, and a lot of anti-government sentiment at this point. And I think there was a series of them, but 1876 was a big year. I think it was when Koch was still in office.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a lot of the things that we see today in our state government that are different, like only meeting every 2 years.
Yeah.
That's where it came out of. They didn't want a state government that met every year, because they were a bunch of anti-government people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. They cut the terms of many of the elected officials from 4 years to 2 years. So that's why our state legislators have to go over 2 years, and many other things that were very restrictive to government. As a result, we have one of the most amended state constitutions of the rest of the states in the country. And although there's been other constitutional conventions in Texas to try to update it, modernize it, no one's had the will to actually do it yet. I think the last one was in the 70s or 80s, and they couldn't get anything done. So we just keep amending it. That's why we keep, I think, 140 some odd amendments at this point. It's crazy. Okay, but all that to say, Sol Ross was one of the conventioners. He represented this area at that convention, and it seems like that's where he had done local offices here. He'd been a sheriff. He'd done some other stuff, but got at the at that state level, and he was kind of a known guy too. He from his Texas Ranger days as a kid, and his connections to the Parker family, and Cynthia Ann Parker. So he was a known guy. Anyway, he started getting, I guess, pulled into that realm. So
yeah, and it connects to one of the first presidents of Texas A&M, but a Baylor grad at Independence. That kind of tells you a little bit of what era we're talking about there. But he's going to serve from 87 to 91. And interestingly, if you think of the Capitol building today, he's the first governor that serves from that building.
Yeah, got to move in. His time, at least from what I've read, I mean, it wasn't as controversial as we saw with Richard Koch. Seemed to have governed a little more stably at that point. The pendulum kind of probably swung back to a more moderate level, and he was able to create other reforms. Again, think about what's going on at this point. I mean, they're trying to get public education going at not just primary and secondary, but also colleges. I think at this point, the Texas A&M College, although it had already been started, was not going so hot, and they at the time he exited as governor, that's where he ends up becoming president of Texas A&M, and we know the story there.
Let's turn to a happier story that moves away from Texas A&M, and that is a name all Baylorites know, which is Pat Neff, the only individual who's ever been president of Baylor and also the highest office in Texas. So he serves as governor of Texas from 1921 to 1925, and not everybody knows that he's. A lot of Baylor folks don't realize 7 years before he's Baylor's president, he was in the governorship. He it was good training for him to become president of Baylor. But he actually went to McGregor High School, so he wasn't a Waco kid, but he was a McLennan County kid. And you can imagine if anybody's been out to Mother Neff State Park, I believe that was some of his family land that. And during his tenure, there was a big push to create state parks, and he led by example. Yeah, in that case. Yeah, and we've talked about him on the podcast before. Dr. Limley, who was our chiropractor, who was arrested 66 times. Go back and listen to that episode. Yeah, but Pat Neff defends him at one point as an attorney. Right. Yeah. And also, one of the big things going on politically during that time is the prohibition movement. And so a little bit of controversy in Pat Neff's career on that. He was, before I think taking the governorship, was a strong prohibitionist. Was a little less strong on it once he was governor. And then, as we'll talk about in a little bit, he ends up inviting, once he's president of Baylor, invites a figure to Baylor who went against some of the Baptist
standards on alcohol consumption, and that led to a little bit of pushback on him.
Yeah, Pat Neff deserves his own episode as well. As we think about folks we should take a deeper dive into.
Yeah. Yep. So, but definitely and I didn't realize this, but it was the age 60 that he took over at Baylor.
Okay, wow.
So he was not a young man.
I didn't realize he was that old.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, who we got next in the governor?
Well, so after Pat, we come to Ann Richards. It takes us a few years, but in 1991.
Oh wait, no. Let's don't forget. You want to mention Price Daniel, or you want to mention Mark White? You gonna come back
but
to
those
them?
are Baylor grads.
Yeah,
they're not from.
They
here.
hung around in town.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
we're not counting those.
We're talking about people. What'd you call it earlier? The Waco Dillon's kids. They're
the anchor babies.
They're Waco.
These are anchor babies. Yeah. Ann Richards is a Lacey Lakeview, but greater Waco,
greater McLennan County.
Yeah, McLennan County. All right, let's talk about Ann Richards because I think she's a fascinating political figure.
Yeah. Like you said, she was born in Lakeview, so it was before it was Lacey Lakeview. That was actually a consolidation of two towns later on. But born in 1933 in Lakeview. Got her bachelor's degree from Baylor. She was a teacher. She began teaching at a junior high in Austin. Entered politics in '76 when she ran for Travis County Commissioner. And then pretty big jump from there. She was then 6 years later elected to the state treasurer and the first woman elected to a statewide office in Texas in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
I guess
Ma Ferguson.
Ma Ferguson's probably, that's a, boy, talk about a strange story in Texas politics. Outside the scope of the Waco History podcast, but so she gained national prominence when she delivered the keynote address in the 1988 National Democratic Convention.
So I remember that speech well. I mean, it's 3 years later she's going to be she's going to get the governorship in Texas. So this really vaults her as kind of a national political figure. And I was looking back at that speech this morning, and I thought it was really interesting. This is the Bush 1 versus Dukakis fight in 1988. The "Where Was George" speech, if you remember that. But in the heart of this speech, she reads a letter from she says a young mother in Lorena. And it's this very heartbreaking letter. I thought I'd read it for you if you want to hear it, Rick.
I'm ready for some heartbreak.
She's lambasting the Reagan administration and connecting Bush, of course, to Reagan as his vice president. But she reads this letter from a young mother in Lorena. Our worries go from payday to payday, just like millions of others, and we have two fairly decent incomes, but I worry how I'm going to pay the rising car insurance and food. I pray my kids don't have to have a growth spurt from August to December, so I don't have to buy new jeans. We buy clothes at the budget stores, and we have them fray, stretch in the first wash. We ponder and try to figure out how we're going to pay for college and braces and tennis shoes. We don't take vacations, and we don't go out to eat. Please don't think me ungrateful. We have jobs, a nice place to live, and we're healthy. We're the people you see every day in the grocery stores. We obey the laws, we pay our taxes, and we fly our flags on holidays. And we plod along trying to make it better for ourselves and our children and our parents. We aren't vocal anymore. I think we may be too tired. I believe that people like us are forgotten in America. Kind of becomes this theme that they're touting at that convention coming off the Republican triumphs in 80 and 84. Right. And of course, Bush is going to crush Dukakis in the 88 election. But out of that convention, the star is really Ann Richards. She becomes a national political figure.
Right. It's funny as you read that, and something we haven't discussed before is the flip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The flip in Texas.
Yeah.
Because as you read that letter, I'm thinking that's a letter we would hear a Republican running for office now read.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So she's right before the flip.
Yeah.
Right.
Or
So,
in the process of the flip.
in the process of the flip. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, because really all these, every person we've discussed up to this point has been a Democrat.
Mm-hmm. So another figure we ought to mention here, really connected to Ann Richards because their fates are kind of intertwined, is Bob Bullock, who again not a Wacoan. I think Bullock is from Abilene or something like that, but goes to Baylor Law. He goes to go to law school at Baylor, and it's Richards and Bullock that are in power when the Southwest Conference falls apart, which may connect back to our
A lot of controversy on that one.
episode you heard earlier with John Morris when we were talking about sports crossroads locally. But it's good timing for Baylor University that they are both in power when the question of where Baylor's going to land as they reshuffle the conference deck in the mid 1990s.
Well, too. So from Bullock's standpoint, he is at Hillsborough High School.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Hillsborough. That's right.
Yeah. So not too far.
Yeah,
we can include him in the Waco History podcast.
That's right.
Hill Junior College, went to Texas Tech, and then Baylor Law.
Extremely powerful figure and kind of mentor to George W. Bush, but extremely powerful figure in Texas politics in the late 20th century.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back and grab a couple of those folks that you mentioned a second ago.
Okay, sure.
Price Daniels
Mm-hmm.
he was governor in Texas. What were the dates on him?
57 to 63.
Yep, 57, 63. And Baylor grad.
Mm-hmm.
The Daniel family has left its mark in Waco.
They have. Yeah. If you look behind the Mayburn Museum, there's an antiquated Texas town that is affectionately known as Billville, which was given to the university by Price Daniel's younger brother, Governor Bill Daniel. Was not governor of Texas. He was governor of, I think it's Guam.
Yeah, and also while you're pondering that in your memory bank, the Bill Daniel Student Center on campus that was built, I believe, in the 40s, came from that family.
Yeah, Bill Daniel was governor of Guam from 61 to 63 and was forever known after that as Governor Bill.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. See, look at all this stuff running right through Waco. And then besides Price Daniel, we had Mark White, who was governor from 83 to 87.
I think also historically while you were at Baylor, he was governor, just to put that in historical
I started
context.
in 87. Thank you.
You started in 87, okay.
Yes.
But a long time. He's a Baylor alum, served Texas Secretary of State, Attorney General, and governor. He claims to be the only Texas governor to host a live bear in the governor's reception room. So Baylor Chamber of Commerce assisted him with that, and you can listen about the bear program at Baylor on another podcast episode. But again, he's also a big advocate in this push to keep put Baylor in the Big 12 when those realignments happened in the 90s. Well, let's go to the highest office in the land.
Well, before we do, we had a couple of we were going to mention some
Leon
senators.
Jaworski? Oh no,
senators.
Senators. Okay.
So we said we mentioned Richard Koch served as senior senator, but also Price Daniel did too.
He did, yeah.
In fact, it's interesting. He did the opposite of Koch. He resigned as senator to become governor. He's the guy who chose. To him, it was a more important role than senator. Yeah. So Let's talk presidential visits.
So there's been a ton of
Yeah.
presidential visits.
I
I
didn't realize it until I looked at it.
As I began to dig into it as well, I was surprised how many I had forgotten. I mean, it's mainly a 20th century story, as you might imagine, but a lot of presidents, in a 21st century story, but a lot of presidents are going to come visit Waco, right, Rick?
Yeah, and probably a lot of that it just has to do with transportation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the ability for a president to get out of D.C. and visit anywhere was probably pretty limited until the first part of the 20th century, and that's what we saw here. So the first brush with a president was in 1911 when Theodore Roosevelt showed up to Waco at the invitation of the Young Men's Business League to address the citizens here. They met out at Katy Park. Used to be the baseball park here.
Yeah, we talked about that on another episode. The attendance. I mean, Katy Park right there on the Katy rail line, the Kansas, Missouri, and Texas. And so it's
Magnolia.
Easy.
I mean,
it's the same. Yeah, home plate where the wiffle ball park is at Magnolia Marketplace is where home plate was at Katy Park, and so would have stepped off the train there to address a large crowd at Katy Park.
Yeah, and I guess in 1911, he was already out of the presidency, right?
So Taft
finished in 09.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but then Taft made a visit to Waco as well.
Yeah. So Taft comes. I think he addresses chapel. He comes and talks at chapel while he's here, which is something I know you skipped often.
No,
you never missed. Sorry.
I was always there.
Yeah, Jeff Dunham was there. Yeah.
Yep. So he spoke at chapel, and then Calvin Coolidge,
Silent Cal,
came through town after leaving office as well.
Yeah, I got the sense that he didn't address it wasn't like he was meeting with folks, right? When Calvin Coolidge came.
Yeah,
I don't think it was a public spectacle.
Couldn't find a lot of detail on that, but he did come through. Okay, so then back to intersecting our story with Pat Neff. After World War II, March 6, 1947, Harry Truman came by. He was the first sitting president to visit Waco. So the other guys were already out of office, but still big deal to have someone like that come through town.
Actually, so this is where a visit actually intersects with international politics. So this is actually the speech that Truman gives at Baylor is a really important speech. So he gets an honorary doctorate from Baylor, and he thanks Pat Neff in that speech. If you want to go look at it, but then he gives this talk about connecting economic policy to. He's essentially articulating the Truman Doctrine, what kind of becomes this controlling idea during the Cold War. So he's laying ideas out for the Cold War about how the U.S. needs to support economically and militarily countries that are fighting against aggression and insurgency. And it's right after, so this is on, I think, March 7th, he gives this speech. On March 12th, he addresses both houses of Congress, and he asks for $400 million.
Wow, $400 million.
Which used to be a lot of money, to support a fight going on in Greece, the civil war that's going on in Greece that is a communist insurgency within Greece. And so that speech at Baylor makes national news or international news because of there he's beginning to talk about the reasons why the U.S. needs to support a fight going on in Greece. And it's also laying out this really bipartisan kind of Cold War framework that the U.S. is going to be committed to for the next 20 years. And so it's a really important speech he gives at Baylor.
Right. Well, and you could see how that led to the Korean War, Vietnam, so on and so forth. So
that's right.
So on a national scale, that was important. But more importantly, from a religious standpoint, even though Truman was a Baptist, he was a drinker.
Yes, he was.
Yes. And so unfortunately, his visit to Baylor and his honorary doctorate given by Pat Neff kind of riled some of the the Baptist leaders at the time.
Yeah, and actually, Baylor's undergoing a bit of a revival in this period as well. So there would have been some religious fervor to push back on the drinking president.
Right. Okay. Well, then, not too far after that, about a decade later, Dwight Eisenhower, in the middle of his first term, is the featured speaker at Baylor in 1956 at the spring commencement.
So Eisenhower, who's going to be president from 53 to 61, first president born in Texas.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So Eisenhower is really important in that regard for Texas history.
Yeah. 9 years later, Lyndon Baines Johnson was the graduation speaker, and he also received an honorary doctorate. I guess he been vice president then or president?
He's president at that point, and his family has all sorts of connections to Baylor as well. Obviously, LBJ doesn't have a Baylor connection, but his family does.
Right. In 76, President Gerald Ford is welcomed by then Baylor president Abner McCall. And people packed Waco Hall to listen to Ford's comments as he talked about our bear in the White House. Well, I'm sorry. No, he received a jacket emblazoned with the words on the back, "Our bear in the White House."
Yeah, so Ford 2 years earlier had given the National Coach of the Year award to Grant Taft in the 1974 season.
Is that called a quid pro quo right there?
Yeah, maybe there's some sort of agreement there.
Yeah.
Also in 76, Reagan comes through. So Reagan's campaigning at this point. He's trying to get the Republican nomination away from Ford in the 76 election, but he comes through and gives a campaign speech in Waco Hall.
Okay, well, the next one's my favorite because it intersects with my life, and I believe yours as well.
Yeah, you're so self-centered.
Well, okay, so Ronald Reagan comes to the Farrell Center. The Farrell Center was just opening in 1988.
This is the opening event.
Yeah.
This is the grand opening of the Farrell Center.
Yeah. And
do you remember that you were there?
Oh,
right?
yeah. I remember getting herded over there with all the other freshmen, and I honestly did not know what I was getting into.
Tell me what you remember about that event.
Standing down there on the floor, Reagan, he's great orator. He was like giving a pep rally speech almost, and well researched because, and of course, as a freshman at Baylor, you're learning all the traditions and all the songs and all the meanings of things or whatever. And whoever wrote his speech wrote all those things into his speech. So, he was eliciting this great response from the Baylor students because he would talk about the Sikkim Bears, or that at the time we actually gave Dr. Pepper to the bear.
Yes, I
remember that.
Yeah. They figured out at some point the bears get cavities, and so they shouldn't be drinking Dr. Pepper. I think I remember he led us in a Sikkim Bear. Like at the end, he put his paw up and did a Sikkim Bears with the crowd.
Oh yeah,
crowd went nuts.
Yeah, it was great.
So he's campaigning. I guess he's
president then.
Yeah, this is the end of his second term, toward the end of his second term. So I guess he's here to campaign for Bush. I can't remember the political circumstances behind why he came. But he gets a jacket similar to Ford's jacket that he got in the 70s.
Well, I'm sure he wore it proudly in the White House too.
So, now that I'm looking at this, we've 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. We're going to have a presidential visit every decade since the 1940s.
I haven't been tracking it exactly, but I think we've only missed Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else?
I'm sure Nixon.
FDR. We didn't know FDR. No Nixon.
FDR. Well, we've picked up since Truman. So I'm sure if Nixon's second term, would have gone better.
But we do have a Nixon connection in a minute that we'll talk about. So we won't leave old poor Nixon out.
That's right.
All right, so moving the timeline forward in 92, before he was president, and in fact, I attended this event as well.
Oh, you did?
With a good friend of ours, Scott Bryson.
Okay.
Who I didn't agree with his politics. But
yeah, still don't.
So at the suspension bridge, Bill Clinton made a stop on during his presidential campaign.
Yeah, do you remember what the thrust was of Clinton's speech there in the Indian Springs Park?
No, I just remember he was way late, and I was really getting perturbed. And I was probably standing so far away I could probably barely hear him or see him. But yeah, I was there though.
Carter also comes in 93. This is, of course, well after his presidency, but he comes and visits Waco in 93 as well.
Yeah, he was a looks like a speaker, distinguished speaker for Herb Reynolds, who was Baylor president at the time.
Mm-hmm. So tell folks, I'm sure if they've lived in Waco any time at all, they know a little bit about the Western White House, but tell folks about that period.
Yeah. So of course, George W. Bush becomes governor first, and then is elected to the presidency. And actually, before he was elected president, he bought about 1,500 acres, I think, just outside of Crawford. I guess that would be west, kind of southwest of Crawford. And raw piece of land. It may have some structures on it, but they built a beautiful house out there. Ironically, at the time, tying this back to my air conditioning background, I worked out at the train plant back then,
mm-hmm.
and they were putting in a geothermal air conditioning system at his new building or his new home, which is what we built actually in Waco. So the everybody in the plant was excited that our equipment was getting used in the future president's
how cool.
House, which was really just a few miles away.
Did you get to go out there for the install?
I didn't. I had some friends that went out there, and I was not invited.
Mm-hmm.
I have, but that was the beginnings of the Western White House, which became incredibly. It brought an incredible spotlight to Waco throughout his presidency,
mm-hmm.
Which I'm sure we could unpack a whole lot there. Everything from, I believe he didn't he have an international conference here that got hosted in Waco?
Yeah,
on big trade conference. Is that right?
Yeah, and I know he met with Vicente Fox, I think, in Waco.
Putin.
Yeah.
Vladimir Putin came to Waco, and was it the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, who knew that these international dignitaries
attended a bunch of Baylor games? I remember I'd go to a game every now and
then, and for a while there was actual hope and a sincere effort to get his library here, presidential library.
Yeah. In fact, there was some discussion. The first discussion I remember of building something across the Brazos was using some of that land that Baylor had acquired to build the presidential library over there. Yeah.
That became the
McLean Stadium.
New McLean Stadium.
And the Clyde Hart Track Complex.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I think the Wacoans are probably more excited to have a stadium over there, but I don't know that for sure.
Well, you rarely get two presidential libraries, so we may still get one, and if you perhaps or our guest Dillon Meek may go on to the presidency, we'll have capacity now to build his library.
Yeah, and then I think we had one more presidential maybe brush with a president.
Yeah, and under unfortunate circumstances, of course, but the West Texas fertilizer plant explosion that occurred in 2013, Baylor actually at the Farrell Center hosted a memorial service for the victims of that fertilizer plant explosion. And President Obama in 2013 came during his presidency. So he was in the White House at the time to address about 4,000 attendees who were at that memorial service.
Another we'd mentioned a second ago, coming back to Nixon as president.
Yeah, it all comes back to Nixon.
In a connection, a Waco connection there. There was a guy who, as far as I know, never ran for public office, but was hugely instrumental in the political process, and that was Leon Jaworski. So give us a little bit of background on Leon.
So Jaworski is really fascinating. We have a long series of oral history interviews with Jaworski in the Institute for Oral History Collections. Born in Texas, immigrant. His mother was a Austrian immigrant. His father was a Polish immigrant. He's named after Spartan King Leonidas. Mm-hmm. Had a brother named Hannibal, so his parents had some flair in naming their children. Champion debater at Waco High, graduated Baylor Law School, and went on to have a pretty amazing legal career. 1925, the youngest person ever admitted to the Texas bar. And, he defends bootleggers during Prohibition, and he joins a little law firm in Houston in 1931 that becomes known as Fulbright and Jaworski. As if you're familiar with law at all in Texas, you know that name. Mm-hmm. One of the largest law firms in the United States. President of Texas Bar, American Bar Association. A really important contribution that Jaworski makes to international law, and this is a period where post-World War II, where they're prosecuting individuals for war crimes, and he's involved in a case where German civilians were accused of murdering 6 American airmen forced down over Germany, and there's all sorts of cases Jaworski's involved in. Interestingly, he could have been central in the Nuremberg trials just because he had that sort of standing as a attorney. But he turned down the opportunity to participate in them because he thought they were based on laws that didn't exist at the time those culpable acts were committed. He had kind of an ethical objection to the ways in which some of those prosecutions were occurring.
Yeah. So fast forward, November 1st, 1973, he became the special prosecutor in the Watergate scandal.
Yeah, we'll remind folks the Watergate scandal, which did not occur in Waco. No. It's
named after actually a hotel, Watergate Hotel, there in D.C. that also has office complex attached to it. And I believe what is alleged is some of Nixon's operatives were breaking into the Democrat National headquarters to get information on the upcoming election.
Yeah, they were trying to get information on George McGovern's kind of campaign strategy for the 1972 presidential election, who was his Democratic opponent. If you go back and look at the results of that election, Nixon did not need to worry about the Democratic campaign strategy. But of course, the issue that Jaworski's involved in Watergate is this investigation into how much did Richard Nixon know or not know with regard to those actions, the break-in at Watergate.
Yeah,
it's interesting. An interesting thing to know that I think most folks don't know is Jaworski had voted for Nixon twice. So he voted for Nixon in the 68 election. Wow. He voted for Nixon in the 72 election. And I think he later votes for Bush. And so he was not, he was very supportive of some Republican candidates for president.
Right.
But I think he's seen as this, but I think he was seen as someone who was fair and impartial and could be a fair judge as a special prosecutor.
Right. It's just amazing when you think about Watergate. Every scandal, big or small, in politics today, gets called something gate.
Mm-hmm.
right? All because of this major incident.
That's right. Yeah, so the big issue that comes down to, the special prosecutor is trying to obtain the tapes Nixon recorded conversations that were on the White House phone, and they were trying to obtain those conversations. Nixon decided to record himself. It wasn't something that was imposed on him, but the special prosecutor wanted to seize those tapes, and of course, ultimately, Nixon hands over the tapes and his resignation at the same time, with a 17-minute gap on the tapes.
That's right.
But there was enough information there that would have fueled the trial after Nixon's impeachment.
Okay, back on the Waco side of things. I think we'd be remiss from a political standpoint in Waco to not mention Lyndon Olson. Yeah,
tell folks about Lyndon.
Lyndon is he becomes the ambassador under Bill Clinton to Sweden in 1997. Does that till 2001. So he's a U.S. ambassador to Sweden. One of the best stories, and you can get this if you go by Uncle Dan's and talk to Dan. He'll tell you about serving barbecue in Sweden. So it's a beautiful story. But
so how do you think we should think about Waco as from this political angle? Let's back up a little bit and look at it from a kind of higher level. If Waco is a crossroads,
right?
What are the ways in which you think it's been kind of a political crossroads over its history?
Well, certainly from we were able to list several personalities that have played an important role, more heavily on the state side, but nationally as well. It's hard to know how that compares to other communities. I mean, we only know ourselves. You hear, this is an unverified stat that, we've had more governors out of Waco than any other community in Texas. It seems like it could be very viable. I don't know if that's an accurate stat or not. We have 3 of them buried in Oakwood Cemetery, so that's probably a winning stat, I would guess. But you think about that. It seems a little bit of an outsized influence politically in the state of Texas, especially early on. I think I mentioned earlier, it feels like we don't have quite the political influence that we might have had years ago. A lot of dynamics that go with that. If you look at the state of Texas, and it's probably varied since the last time I looked a year or two ago, but population-wise, McLennan County is 18th, 19th, 20th in population. If you took the top 2 or 3 counties in Texas, their population is more than the rest of the state together. Yeah. So the way Texas has grown out, or at least where it is now, the political power really rests in the major metroplexes.
Yeah, so Waco sometimes is a bit of flyover country in some respects, in some of those big political questions. And of course, part of Texas's status is we haven't been a swing state in a long time as far as in national politics. And so I think that leads to less attention as far as national politics go.
Right. So I think it'll be interesting as Waco's fortunes continue to increase, how that changes the dynamic. We've had a lot of spotlight, whether it's through Magnolia or even athletic events at Baylor or teams there that have performed well. There's been a lot more national focus, it feels like, than what we see, in the previous 50 years or so.
I think so. I think this conversation is not terribly disconnected from the next conversation that we're going to have on the Crossroads series that will look as Waco as a military crossroads over its history.
Yeah.
So, Rick, I look forward to being back with you again on that one.
Sounds great. All right.
Ride hard
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production.